Okay, hi everybody, and welcome. Those of us who are joining us live and those of us watching the recording. We are so excited to welcome you here today for our first collaboration between the Institute of Communication and Religion here at Seton Hall and the Center for Sports Media. We're excited about this because we believe that sports and religion and spirituality have so much to give to one another and so much to inform one another, even when they seem like perhaps contradictory forces, sports being about winning and religion or spirituality being about giving. We're going to argue today that it's a far more complex relationship and that there's much to be learned. So it's my pleasure and privilege to welcome and introduce Jane McManus, who is the director of the Center of Sports Media, who has plenty of experience in this field, an established journalist, a leader in her area, and a great joy to work with. So Jane, I pass it on to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ruth. And this has been a true collaboration between Ruth and myself and Director John Radwin for the Institute of Communication and Religion here at Seton Hall. So hello to everyone and welcome to Spirituality and Inclusivity in Sports, Building Bridges, Not Barriers. The idea for this panel, the idea of collaborating began as soon as I started last year here at Seton Hall, but the idea for this particular panel began back in September when then Interim Dean Renee Robinson and I attended a summit called Sport for All at the Vatican. It was a 2-day summit, beautiful, obviously, and there were representatives from the Paralympics, the UN, the Special Olympics, and there were dozens of athletes there with incredible stories, including Kenyan runner Tegla LaRoupe. And there were 6 of us there from different Big East schools, including Val Ackerman, the Big East commissioner. And we decided that we had to find ways to bring these conversations back to our home institutions. And that was where the idea for this particular panel was born. Unfortunately, Val Ackerman had an unexpected responsibility arise yesterday and had to send her regrets. So I'm going to start by introducing the panelist who has nobly stepped in at the last moment. Professor Max Engel, and a PhD at Creighton University, where he teaches the sports and religion class. He is there by joint appointment with the theology and education departments at Creighton University's College of Arts and Sciences. He has written extensively on this, including his most recent book, which he co-authored, called On the Eighth Day, A Catholic Theology of Sport, which we will be getting into this conversation on this pretty extensively. So thank you, Max, and welcome. I'll move on to our next panelist now, Professor Steve Kass, who's an adjunct professor of Catholic Studies here at Seton Hall. He is a speaker, educator, and specialist in Catholic adult faith formation and catechesis. He is also the executive vice president with Five, an energy consulting company. But for the purposes of this conversation, he has written and spoken extensively on the issues of sport and religion for different Catholic publications, and he's been featured on several different national Catholic radio programs. And he's also a veteran who served 14 years in the Navy. And thank you for your service. And last and certainly not least is Vice President for Mission and Ministry here at Seton Hall, Father Colin Kay, who majored in Latin at Columbia University, which may have been a harbinger of things to come looking back. He also graduated from Immaculate Conception Seminary School of Theology in 2004 and was ordained in 2005 by the Archdiocese of Newark. And in 2019, he was appointed to his first job here at Seton Hall, which is just steps from where he grew up. So welcome home, Father Colin, and also welcome to this conversation. So thank you all so much for agreeing to come and talk about this. We are going to open it up for questions at some point later on. So if any of the participants who are watching have a question that they'd like to think about, please feel free to put it in the chat and we will get there. But first, I'm going to start by asking Max something around the summit that we attended. I kind of want to give people who are here a sense of what happened there and what some of the things are that we experienced. So much of the conversation about the way that sports and playing sports can be a transformative experience for a lot of people, and how that connects to people's sense of who they are, their sense of self, their sense of larger connections and religion even. And what were some of your biggest takeaways from attending that event?
Yeah, thanks, Jane. The Sport for All conference builds on a conference that started in 2018, or was held in 2018, that came up with a document that was giving the best of ourselves. And 4 years later, the Pope and the Vatican convened a further conversation, say, okay, we have this great document, but are we putting it in action? What are we doing? How can we encourage? We say these nice words, but what's the action? What can we do to foster um, specific concrete choices that further make sport available to all? And so the first thing I think that people might find surprising is the church reiterated its commitment to supporting sport. And for some people, that's a bit of news. Like, wait, sports, Vatican, what's going on here? And the Catholic Church is unapologetically, we've been involved in sports since the beginning, since St. Paul. And so that there is a natural connection. There's a lot of overlap there in between, what it means to be human, and sports are profoundly human. And as we're created in the image of God, that it's a natural for us, for the church, to be involved in sports. So that's the first takeaway. And a second takeaway is the document, the declaration in 2022. So the document in 2019, the declaration in 2022, emphasize that sports are not an absolute good. There's a lot of great potential in sports, and it's wonderful, and it's why many of us, I'm sure, consider ourselves sports fans or athletes. But there's also, for sports are profoundly human, there's a susceptibility to sin, and so sports can be corrupted, they can be corruptive, they can be corrosive, and so the church wants to say, hey, what are we doing to emphasize what's best and most beautiful and most life-giving about sports? And so there's a real prophetic witness in that document, in the declaration, saying, hey, this is important, this is profoundly human, and there's the potential to over commercialize, to exclude, to use sports for political or economic gain, to diminish the real potential to bring people together, to encounter oneself, to encounter one's neighbor, and that neighbor being all of humanity. And so there's a real prophetic voice to both caution against the over commercialization, the over exploitation of sports, and a real hopeful and welcoming invitation to see sports as an opportunity to include everybody with disabilities, cognitive or physical disabilities from all walks of life, crossing barriers, economic, cultural, social, religious, that sports are available for everybody. And, whether someone's on the margins or someone comes from a very affluent community, sports need to be accessible. And the beauty of sports and the opportunity to grow and to foster community in and through sports should be acceptable to accessible to everyone. And so for me, that's a great question to start this panel, that conference really reiterated the potential of sports in the Catholic Church's keen interest in using sports as the positive dimension of sports that sports can be.
Professor Kass, Steve, sorry, let me send it over to you next, because I think, Max raises some great points that probably could be responded to individually, but I'll start with this one. What do we lose about sports when we make professional sports our focus? And I think you could argue that in American culture, there is often a focus on professional sports and the winning losing aspect and the competitiveness of it.
Yeah, I think we lose a lot. I mean, because just by the very word elite, the word elite itself suggests that it's not for everybody. Less than 1% of the whole population plays professional sports. So what do we have to say to the 99% that don't participate? What do we say to the vast majority of people? I mean, even college students, I think the stats are something like 1 in 250 college students go on to play pro sports. So what do you say to all those people? So an exclusive focus on elite athletes for me is it's the word limiting isn't even big enough. It's exclusionary and it's damaging. And I think that's where sports runs into problems, just as Max said, with corruption, excessive focus on money, fame, status, all those things. And uh, the church cares about sports precisely because, again, as Max said, it brings people together from so many different communities, cultures, backgrounds, demographics, races, creed. I mean, sports has a unique ability to do that, and by only focusing on that very, very small percentage, we lose a lot.
So then, Father Colin, I'm going to turn it to you to say, as when we're looking at a university as educators, kind of in between those two things, the best things about sports and then the dangers of sports. Why would a university have sports?
Thank you, Jane, and thanks to you all. Um, let's go back to the beginning. Forgive me for going all priest on you, but I am a Roman Catholic priest. We, Roman Catholics, believe in a God who became a human being, became flesh, which presumably means, and I do not know enough about that region of the world in the time of Jesus, but Jesus of Nazareth as a child must have played. Um, we believe in a God who has become a man. We believe in God who has become a body. We believe in a God as we approach Holy Week now and the weeks of the days of the Triduum and the solemn celebration of our Lord's resurrection. We believe in a God who is risen from the grave with a glorified body. Um, so, a Catholic university like Seton Hall, committed as we are to the whole person. Um, our students are much more than just, forgive me for putting it this way, much more than just brains on a stick. They are so much more than that. They are, yes, mind, but they are also heart. They are also spirit. Our founding bishop here, James Roosevelt Bailey, envisioned this place to be a home for the mind and the heart and the spirit. But with all due respect to Bishop Bailey, I would want to add an asterisk and say, and a home for the body also. We want our students to have a full and complete experience of what it means to grow, and that includes growing into and with your physical body and experiencing the joys and the pains, the victories and the defeats, the all of the things that physical activity can involve. Um, as Max so rightly pointed out, though, there are challenges, moderation in all things. We run the danger of one going to one extreme or the other, but the middle way of mind and heart and spirit and body is right at the very heart of who we are and what we're about.
And so then, Max, I think this is a great springboard for this question, because you're an athlete, and I think many of the people who are interested in the connection between spirituality and sports, and certainly people who are interested in the study of sports, are there because of an experience with sports that affected them personally. And so let me ask you then, what is that? Is there a connection between playing sports and something larger? Is that a way, is the experience of your body a way that you can experience something beyond yourself, or a connection of some kind?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it builds, I think, a little bit on Father Colin's comment there, that, you know, we have Catholic universities exist to make us more human. And if we're more human, we're more in the image of the God who created us. We're more to be that. And I think that when we exercise our bodies, we're exercising what God has given us, and we've experienced, and what we grow in that. So part of Catholic education is to be more human, and sports are an intrinsic part of being more human, and they have that place there. And I think if there's the notion that God didn't need to create us, God played us into existence. Like, and so when we freely play, we're perhaps imitating, or more closely imitating, the God who created us freely out of great love. And God didn't work us into existence, God played us into existence. And so when we play, we encounter perhaps ourselves as we were created to be. And then when we see that freedom, it's like the joy of watching a World Cup game, the Women's World Cup coming up this summer, or the Men's World Cup this fall. There's a freedom, there's that genius of Messi on the soccer pitch. Like, there's a freedom there, and it's like, wow, that's incredible. And that's incredible on sort of one sort of given scientific level, but how beautiful is that he's using the gifts that God gave him to, within these parameters of rules of creation of the game, to demonstrate that. So your question, Jane, is, I do think that when we are athletes, we're freely playing, we're enjoying ourselves, we're pushing our limits, we're exploring this world that God gave us, whether it's a run, whether it's a mountain bike, a climb, a swim, a team sport, a volleyball, whatever it might be, we're encountering freely playing. And it is through those experiences, I think, that God can be particularly evident to us if we're open to recognizing God in those experiences. So, yeah.
And Steve, I'm going to then pass it to you. Take us into your sports and religion class a little bit. How do, at a Catholic institution in particular, how do sports connect to religious teachings? What is it that, how can you draw that one-to-one, or is it an inference?
Well, it's funny you asked that, because most people, when they step into my class, they think I'm going to talk about Tim Tebow. And no disrespect to Tim Tebow, but that's the last time I mention Tebow, is when I say we're not going to talk about him anymore. The truth is that the way you draw the connection, and it's based off what Max and Father Colin said. We were created in the image and likeness of God, body and soul, both and so therefore we have to take appropriate steps to form ourselves, both body and soul. So the connection is that, and everyone knows this, as an athlete, you're not going to become a better athlete by accident. It's not going to happen by osmosis. You can't sit on your couch and think your way into becoming a better athlete. It doesn't work that way. And it's the same thing with your spiritual life. You can't just sit on your couch and hope, gee, I really hope one day I become more holy or more mature in my spiritual life. You have to apply disciplines and practices to both. And the virtues that are necessary for one to grow as an athlete are the same virtues and practices and disciplines that you have to apply to growing and maturing in your spiritual life. It's why Paul used the image of an athlete as a metaphor in his first letter to the Corinthians. Why did he use it? Because he knew they'd get it. He was in Corinth, and athletic games and events were, that was well known to anybody living in and around Corinth when Paul was there. And so he used the analogy of sports, not because he wanted people to get into a better fitness routine. He used the analogy because he wanted them to apply the same rigor to growing as Christians as they would apply to growing in their spiritual lives. And guess what? They're hard. It's not going to happen by, as I said, just kind of sitting on your couch and hoping that some sort of change or transformation occurs. You have to work at both, and it's fueled by disciplines and virtues that are common to both athletes and to anybody that wants to grow in their spiritual life. What I'll call spiritual athletes. That's often the first phrase that I'll use the word spiritual athletes, and I get like people look at me like I have two heads. Like, what are you talking about? But that's exactly what we're discussing here, is how do you become a spiritual athlete?
Jane, may I ask a question of
Absolutely.
Stephen and Max? Then would we go so far as to say that whenever I have said to someone else, I am not an athlete, I'm quite wrong in that to be human is to be athletic, to be human is to want to kick that ball or swing
I
that
personally, I believe yes. and Max touched on it. I think the human person is hardwired for play. It's part of who we are. When you think about the human person, we're so unique, and animals don't create things that are designed for sport. The human person does. The human person is unique in that having that capability to create things for no other intention than for sport and or games. So I think it is hardwired into our DNA. And when we use those words, I'm not an athlete, I think implicit in that is maybe I'm not an elite athlete, or maybe I'm not very good. But nonetheless, we are all athletes because we exercise our bodies in some shape, manner, or form. That's my opinion.
Max, you want to take that?
No, I think Stephen did a good job sort of summarizing that. I think it's well said. So.
Well, then maybe I'm gonna pass this to you in a different way than Father Colin, which is, the Vatican started its own federation of sorts in 2018, a sports federation, and the Vatican, as you all are fully aware, is tiny compared to any other country that participates in international sports. So they've opened this team to not just the people who are residents of the Vatican, but also to employees and children of employees, so that they can field a few players for sports like cycling and martial arts. Again, just a few. They're not fielding a soccer team for FIFA, nothing like that quite yet. And I don't know that the ambitions actually lead there either. However, they have begun a program of international competition, and many sports competitions are interested in having the Vatican flag listed among the countries participating in these events. And so Father Colin, what I'll ask you then is, as much as different universities around the country have teams, what is the role that a sports team like that has for the Vatican?
I'm not in a position to speak, of course, directly for the Vatican or as a Vatican spokesperson, but I think I would say that it is all part and parcel of the way we began this conversation. To be authentically Roman Catholic is to be authentically human. There is nothing that matters to human beings that does not matter to the church, properly understood. The church has been forever about what is good, what is true, and what is beautiful. And as anyone who took any interest in watching Messi and Argentina win that World Cup this past summer, that was beautiful. It was beautiful, and all the commitment that goes into it. So the Vatican being involved, what is the expression? Flying the flag. I think it's an important witness. I think it is an important witness to the church not being only that fortress on the hill, but down there, meeting the people, meeting human beings where they are. That's what we're seeking to do here at a university like Seton Hall. That's what we're seeking to do in parishes. That's what we're seeking to do, I believe, as the Vatican City State. Connecting with people where they are. And that can get complicated, of course, I think. When you meet people where they are, sometimes it can get a little down and dirty, I suppose. But all for the good, all blessed, I think.
I know you don't officially speak for the Vatican, but the answer that you gave was really remarkably similar to one that was there organically at that event, which was that the church is concerned with all things human, and so if humans are concerned with them, then very much so is the church. And also, I think in terms of reaching younger people, reaching younger Catholics, connecting with Catholics around the world who maybe want to feel or long to feel more connected, and that this being a way to reach out to those people and present an activity, something that they feel connected with already, and using that as a conduit, I think, was another interesting part of that discussion.
And can I jump in real quick, Jane? I
Yeah.
think it's a little bit, Seton Hall University, they have a prominent sports teams in the Big East, and flying the flag. I think Father Colin's right, and he asked. I have a fourth grade son, and he will tell you that Shaheen Holloway is the Seton Hall basketball coach. He might know where Seton Hall is. I think I've told him it's in New Jersey, but that's how he encounters and how he learns about Seton Hall, and like, oh, like, kind of what's some of the history there. So I think the Vatican is interested, as you said, Jane, to connect and to establish value. There's a much larger, as Steve mentioned, there are many students at Seton Hall who are involved in sports far beyond who compete in the Big East Conference athletically, but they sort of represent, the premier, the elite, to use Steve's word. Athletes are representing much more, the whole institution with Seton Hall University. And I think the Vatican is interested in some of that as well. It's making a connection, as Father Colin said, with other people. And we see that, when my son's a great example. He knows all the teams in the Big East Conference. He knows they're in men's basketball. He knows who their coaches are. He can usually tell you who's, in the standings and where they are. So I think there's some of that going on too.
Well, and
I'll
Max,
put him in touch with admissions, Max, by the way.
Sure thing.
great idea. Well, Max, maybe you can take us a little deeper into this, because I don't know how much of a history lesson you're prepared to give at the moment. But I'm going to put you on the spot with that, because you have
Sure.
co-written the book on it.
Sure.
But there is this, and something that I witnessed covering sports in New York City. I covered Iona for a while. I covered Manhattan when I first started off as a sports writer. Both of those are Catholic institutions. I worked at Marist, and now I work here. And so to me, there is this deep connection, particularly in New York City, but I imagine it's around the world, a deep connection between the Catholic Church and basketball programs writ large. They were a large part of parishes. They were a way to occupy young people. We often talk about keeping them out of trouble. Well, that was happening in the 40s and 50s and 60s in New York City as well. And I just wonder if you can give us a little bit of the history of that. I mean, I think of also the boxing programs that the Catholic Church was involved in early days. Maybe you can take us a little bit to the history there.
Yeah, I think a lot of perhaps it starts with the CYO, right? The Catholic Youth Organization, so the sports programs. And I'm thinking of Archbishop Shiel in Chicago in the 30s and 40s, and how, he looked around his diocese and said he did a couple of powerful things. And one of the things was he integrated CYO in the 30s and 40s in Chicago, and this was unheard of. And with the Catholic Church in the United States, it's a history by and large of immigrants, and we collected in urban enclaves. And basketball in those, it's an easy game. You don't need a lot of space. You don't need 100 yards by 60 yards or what have you. And there's something, it's interesting you mentioned the boxing, Jane. There's something sort of the corporal, the physical. There is explanations that there's something in the boxing that's deeply Catholic, sort of the blood and the pushing and the resurrection and getting off the mat and all of that. I find that interesting. What I think is more profound is that basketball was just the accessible sport in urban settings for Catholics to engage in and play in having a gymnasium with a wood floor and an iron hoop and a leather ball. And I think writ large, I think Catholicism is particularly attuned to sports and the body and the incarnation, and that the body matters. And we don't have a history as, the Puritans, sort of separating from the body. The Catholic tradition has always been, I think it was Steve who mentioned the both and, like it's body and spirit. And the Catholic Church has always embraced that. It's a very corporal element because of that incarnation. And we've never been afraid to, pile up images of the body or pile up images of play and recreation, and really celebrating that. in a way that perhaps some of our Protestant brothers and sisters, they may be more reticent, sort of the Calvinistic, the Puritan doctrine, play, no, we don't play, we work hard, that New England ethos, perhaps from early in our history. So historically, there's all of those things I think come together in sort of basketball and in the American context, certainly in the latter half of the 20th century. Off the top of my head, I love that question, but I think that's what I would say.
Just to build on what Max was saying, it even, even before that, I think a lot of it has to do with the Jesuits.
Sure.
You look at the Jesuit institutions that are sprung up all over the world. It was the Jesuits who really recognized that there's a need for this idea of physical education. And so they adopted that into their curricula. They carved out time specifically to exercise one's body. And this goes back to the 16th century. So the Jesuits were instrumental, and it really manifests itself during those early years when the Jesuits began their missions to North America. When they encountered Native Americans, they saw the commonality of what we would probably call today lacrosse, but some form of game that they played, and that enabled the Jesuits to see these Native Americans for their humanity and not as just primitive people, but they saw that, hey, they play games too, they play sports too. So the Jesuits were doing this 500 years ago, and putting into practice this idea of using sports to bring people and cultures and communities together to connect our common humanity.
May I ask, I'm sorry, Stephen and Max, maybe Jane also, the Catholic tradition worldwide, or especially here in the United States, any distinction in our tradition between, you mentioned boxing earlier, Max, between sports, and I don't mean to throw boxing under the bus, please, or even mixed martial arts or anything, but is there any distinction that the Catholic tradition has made between sports that where pain and injury are a byproduct of competition, and sports that, at least on the surface, seem to more directly inflict pain and perhaps injury as a way toward victory?
I mean, it goes back at least to Augustine. I mean, you want to go there, Steve?
No, go ahead. Sure.
I mean, it's, Augustine had, I think his friend's name was Alypius, and he loved going to the forum to see the conflict, and very sober, and then he gets there and it's the bloodlust, and Augustine is encouraging his friend, like, you can't go to the forum to see this bloodletting. I mean, this is not Catholic, this is not Christian, you can't do that. And it's that, so the Catholic Church has, at least to Augustine, sort of taken sort of an approach that we sort of the moderate path. Boxing, what we know about boxing now is far different than what we knew about boxing a couple decades ago. And so I think the Catholic Church, I don't necessarily speak for the Catholic Church, but in our Catholic social doctrine and our Catholic social teaching, it gives a really clear sense of, like, okay, what is the purpose of sports? How does sports work? And it really contemporarily gives us some pause about sort of the dangers of concussion, perhaps the dangers in boxing. Certainly some of those less regulated or sort of more martial sports would raise a concern. But historically, there is some of that, but not related to boxing that I know of necessarily.
Yeah. And I think the other part of that you have to factor into is, what is the intent behind the activity? Because a common question that gets brought up in my class anyway is, what about football? What about football and the risks, and what are the moral and ethical issues around the risks of CTE? And I think the part of the answer is that, the intent of football is not to harm somebody. Now, there may be some people who play the game with that intent, but overall, the intent of football is to score more points than your opponent. If you happen to, there is risk of injury in that. And the church, I don't think, would shy away from activities where there is risk of injury, where the church would probably have something to say, is what is the intent of the sport? That's where, as Max was saying, with UFC and some of these combat sports, it's a good question to ask around the intent and the object of the game. But I don't think the church would ever steer away from saying you shouldn't play this sport because there is a risk of injury.
I find this fascinating. This conversation is fascinating, and I'm learning so much. I will say to that last point is that I think part of the appeal of sports is the bloodlust. I think particularly, as somebody who covered football for, 10, 15 years and from the press box watched dozens of players become injured and carted off the field during the course of my career. I very much sympathize with that feeling, that thrill of a feeling that comes when you do see things like that happen. I recognize it as, it's not something that I, want to parade around and tell the world about, but I do recognize it in myself and I feel it. So it's interesting that you talk about kind of doing something for that thrill. I think of, for example, going to the Roman Colosseum and what it must have been like to sit in those stands and witness the games and, the thrill of the gladiatorial, bouts. And I do think that part of us as humans, we recognize that feeling. But I don't know. I am interested here then to hear you say, Steve, that probably isn't something that is to be nourished in the same way that some of the other values that come from sports should be.
Yeah. If we start with the premise that we were created in the image and likeness of God, us and our opponent. So therefore, if that is true, then what are the moral implications of participating? Like Max said, boxing today and wrestling today are not what they were in the first century. But what are the implications of participating in something where your intent is to harm or potentially injure or back then kill another human person created in the image and likeness of God? There's some there and the early church theologians had big problems with that.
So Father Colin, then I'm going to come to you on this next question, which I think is interesting in light of all these things that have been said. How important is winning? We're at Seton Hall, where I think we probably would have preferred a little bit more of it in the postseason. Max over there at Creighton, he can sit on his laurels, I guess, a little bit more. But that is part of, when you look at the actuality of sports, and certainly in a college setting, winning is important.
I know earlier in the conversation we talked about being hardwired to play, so we are all athletes. I think I'm a little bit more hardwired for donuts, but as I get along, and I think that the human person is hardwired for not necessarily winning, but I would say for excellence. The human being is hardwired for excellence. And that's just something deeply true about us. And I think it is something that can be a little bit distorted by this fallen world of ours and a culture of, Francis does call it, a throwaway culture and using people as things and as commodities. But winning is important. I mean, forgive me, I don't mean to get too personal. I don't want to turn this into a Father Colin Kay therapy session. But I think I'm still not over it. I was not the last kid picked when captains were choosing sides in grammar school, but I was second or third to last just about every time, And the last thing I ever wanted on a basketball court was the ball. I mean, and in the outfield, please, please, please. I was one of those kids. Please, 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 God, I'll do anything. Don't let the ball come to me. Don't let him hit it my way. I think that's an indication that for all of our hardwiredness toward winning, for all our hardwiredness toward excellence, there's a bit of a fallen original sin, corporate sin, distortion there, um, that I think many of us feel in so many different areas of life, not just in an athletic competition, but in the academic competition that can be the classroom. I'm afraid to raise my hand because I could be wrong. I'm afraid to ask a question because it could sound stupid. I'm afraid to take the shot because I might miss. Um, I think that winning is important because, yes, we are hardwired for excellence, and people will know Seton Hall less and less for sports if we lose more and more, Um, and yet, a cutthroat culture of winning and losing. To be the winner is to be perfectly human, to be fully human is, let me just put it this way, it's more than about winning. I mean, the Christ whom we will celebrate in this next Holy Week, he lost. He lost hard and bad on the cross and came back. So we are about excellence. We are about winning, and there's something awfully redemptive about losing too. Sorry, I can go on forever.
Steve, it looks like you want to jump in on that.
Yeah, I think that the thing we have to avoid, now Father Colin's words, hardwired for excellence. It's winning at all costs. That's where you start to go down a very dark and bad path. Winning at all costs, where competitions are a zero-sum game. I win, you lose, and therefore I'm going to do whatever it takes to win. That's where this gets really, really dangerous. That's where corruption starts to enter into it. That's where you have risks of performance enhancing drugs. That's where you have all the potentiality for, just as Max said at the very beginning, the dark side of sports starts to come out and starts to be put on display when you have this zero-sum game of I win, you lose. What if we looked at sports through a lens where, instead of, go back to the Vatican's document title, giving the best of yourself, hardwired for excellence, we strive to give the best of ourselves. What if there were a world of sports where you're competing less against somebody else, but you're competing with what's possible? What if that were a framework for sports? If it were, then you start to get into a place where what happens to elite athletes is great, but it's not the exclusive focus. If you can compete with what's possible. So for the kid who is chosen, maybe second to last and on the bet for the basketball game or for a pickup game, excellent performance for that person looks very different from other people. But what matters is that that person gives the very best of themselves in that effort.
Well, and maybe building off of what you two have said, that sports are a way of practicing. We can practice so that if we have that inherent fear of speaking up, we practice in a sports context of doing something we're afraid of, so that when it really matters in our real lives and in other forums and fields, then we have we have a couple reps under our belts in a way that where the stakes aren't as high, our high school gymnasium or something like that. So I'm going to ask this of Max and Steve, and that is, are there scriptural examples of sports? You mentioned, Paul in his letter to the Corinthians. Are there other areas that I think wrestling, is often mentioned? Just off the top of my head, are there other areas where there are particular things that come up for your classes?
Max, you want to start?
Sure. It's, St. Paul uses the metaphor of boxing. He boxes the air and running. The Old Testament is surprisingly quiet often in sports. There's some sort of minor examples of, gymnasia and some different things in the Old Testament. But I think that that's been, in some ways, that it gives the church today a real clean slate for how to craft an understanding of Christianity in sports, because we don't have a deep, rich tradition of sports in scripture. So as you mentioned, Jane, St. Paul is in the New Testament where we would go, um, but there's really not a lot of reference. There's a paucity of references, and it's something that we've noted before, sort of in the academic field. But would spin that's a real positive. That gives us an opportunity to really craft a contemporary theology of sport, or looking at sport, that doesn't necessarily draw on, or have to come to terms with a legacy from Scripture that maybe other areas of our world today we have to kind of wrestle with more explicit explanations of different topics in our contemporary culture. Um, I think that's how I would preface this.
The other thing I just to add on to that is, in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, as Max was saying, there are references to boxing and running the race, but I think the equally as important reference in that 9th chapter of 1 Corinthians is where Paul says he's pointing to the athletes. He's saying these athletes, they do what they do to win a perishable crown, but we should strive for one that's imperishable. And that's, to me, that's the genius of Paul, is that he's using, again, these metaphors that people will know, they'll understand, and they'll get these metaphors. But he's saying, look, you're putting forth all this effort to win a crown, a distinction that is going to go away. If you're willing to apply all of this effort and discipline and apply all this energy towards something that at the end of the day is going to go away, why wouldn't you do that for your salvation? Why would you not apply the same rigors to those things that make you a successful athlete and focus on something that's eternal? You look at athletes that put in all this time and effort to practice. I mean, we take all kinds of things that we want to get good at to the extreme. If you want to play the guitar, you'll play the guitar till your fingers bleed. You'll do all these things to get better. Why don't you do that for your eternal salvation too? Isn't that a little more important? So I think that's the other part of Paul's letter to the Corinthians I think is so important to take away from this.
Excellent point. And it kind of leads me to my next question for Max, which is, from the Summit for Inclusion, and just this idea that that was raised there, which is this idea of the inherent divinity of everyone, and how that requires us to care about providing access to sports for people who don't normally have it. The example I'm thinking of particularly was the representative from the UN who came to talk about the refugee teams that have been promoted and I think funded in part through Catholic charities that allow people in. And as you all know, there are refugees who've been kind of trapped in between physical places, not allowed back into one and not allowed into the next. And can be there for years. And just the ability to move and play and provide sport. Is this something inherently kind of a calling that people have to think about these, the people who've been left behind when it comes to sports?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm always cautious about inherently, because my students, maybe Stephen can relate to this too. We talk about the default, the sports are great. And I think we need to be in one of the church's documents, in the declaration, and certainly at the back in Rome at the Sport for All conference, that we have to be intentional about fostering the potential of sports. And so there are numerous examples of refugees coming together, or having volleyball clubs or volleyball leagues, soccer leagues, teams. There's stories about nations in conflict coming together, or communities that are riven by social strife or economic strife that come together through sports. Whether it's a team for a town or whether it's a league, and you get to cross those boundaries. What I think what the Catholic Church is certainly trying to stress is we need to be intentional about that. It doesn't just happen. Sports can be used as proxies for economic or cultural conflict. And you get, I'm thinking of Rangers Celtic in Scotland, for example, in Glasgow, or sort of the Belgrade Red Star, for example. Some of you get into this sort of jingoistic, xenophobic element, and we got to be very cautious in resisting that. But I think that if you get kids together, they will play. It's we, the adults, that screw it up. And so we, the adults, need to be very intentional. And I think that's what the church is prophetically calling we, the adults in sports, to use sports for their potential to be conduits for community, to build communion. And I think it's the same thing with morality. Unfortunately, our research shows us that we can communicate disvalues through sports in youth sports, and we have to be very intentional about stressing the didactic moral potential of learning about hard work and integrity in communion with 10-year-olds, 7-year-olds, 12-year-olds. Otherwise, they can learn, hey, a 10-year-old learns sports is about winning. The weak are shunted aside. All these different things. We need to be very cautious, very careful. And I think that's a real area that the church has a voice, and it needs to continue spreading that forward to make sure that the best of sports are what we are handing on to our children, that we're engaging with ourselves and bring it to our best selves. But I definitely see that potential, and there's a lot of examples of sports bringing people together, and it's really gives us hope going forward.
One of the challenges to sport in that document, giving the best of yourself, one of the challenges that the document points to as one of the biggest risks to sports are spectators.
Yeah, parents,
parents, coaches. So when you step back and think about it, what is the role of a spectator in sport? What role do they play? So you can ask that. It's kind of an existential question to ask yourself. Where do spectators fit into this milieu? But again, taken to the extreme, I would suggest some of the individuals and actors that probably work against bringing people together more than anything else are spectators, fans, coaches, parents, everybody but the spectators. Social media. I mean, to me, that's one of the largest obstacles to sport, and the goodness of sport is the role of fans and those who don't, everybody who doesn't participate. Just talk to your average Red Sox and Yankees fan and just let that sit for 30 seconds, and you'll see where that goes. It's denigrating. It's the language that's used is horrible. It is absolutely an us versus them type of conversation, when the truth is most of the athletes, they respect their competitors, but it's the fans that take things, to that dark side of sports, like Max was saying.
Father Colin, anything to add there?
I did have a thought, and it's just kind of out of my old head. Yeah, it's well, first of all, what on an elite level, of course, the fans, the spectators in person and via every sort of device, we make the sports possible, I suppose. We fund them. We make it possible for athlete X to make so many millions of dollars. And on another level, I think it might be a little bit, I think there might be an analogy here on a deeper level. I don't mean to get too to get too lofty, but what is a poem if no one has ever listened to it? Does a song need someone not just to sing it, but to hear it and respond to it? Does a book need not just a writer, but a reader? Does an online conversation at Seton Hall need not just participants, but spectators, auditors, and involved spectators and auditors. Does an athlete, even a 5-year-old playing t-ball or something, does an athlete need someone watching, a dad? Does a girl need a mom watching her take that penalty kick? Is that part of the experience of sport that validates us as human beings, connects us as human beings? We belong to one another, created as we are, the image and the likeness of God, as brothers and sisters. I wonder, do we need one another? Yes, it can go down a dark path, Yankees, Red Sox, but maybe in God's providence, Yankees and Red Sox hating one another, fans, it's better than Boston and New York sending armies against one another and meeting someplace in Connecticut, you know? So maybe it's a pressure release valve.
Max, did you want to add to that? I think, one of the things I'll add is that, that there's not just the dynamic of the fans and the teams. There's also the dynamic of fans with each other. And in some ways, for the secular, sitting and watching a sporting event with like-minded people may be as close as they get to a religious experience. And in many ways, the comparisons are numerous. Yet, the idea there, of course, is that, one group pulls for a team and one group pulls for something much larger than a team. So I think it is interesting to think about what is that role. It seems like it's something like with the rest of humanity, that people in groups can work for very noble aims, or they can work for aims that are abhorrent, that it simply depends on what the focus of that is. Which brings me to things like sports betting or name, image, and likeness, or cannabis use. As a society, we have certainly loosened some of the restrictions that used to be in place when it comes to those different concepts. Where do those things fall in this conversation? I don't know if you all have any thoughts on that. Sports betting, something, of course, it's been around, but has been legal for many, many years up until 2018, when the Supreme Court overturned the PAPSA decision and allowed different states to start regulating sports betting. And New Jersey was, the very first, I believe, to start loosening those restrictions. How does that factor in here? Open that up to anybody.
Sure. Steve, you want to go first, or?
Sure. One of the risks that the Vatican indicated is a great risk to sports is spectators. The other is corruption. And so I think sports betting factors, heavily into this. And, and it's not just the advent of sports betting has certainly aggravated this, but, talk to the White Sox in 1918 when they threw the World Series. Sports betting has probably been around since the very first sporting event that was ever created. You had sports betting that followed right on its heels.
In the Coliseum, there was sports betting.
I'm sure that absolutely 100%. So this is not new. I think what's new is the technology, and the dangers here, I think especially recently, is the ability to influence the game itself while it's in progress. Real-time sports betting and the potentiality to affect an outcome in real time, I think is a big danger. And I don't know if Max, if you have any other thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's with the technology and the proliferation of prop bets, and I don't think we as an American culture, as a society, have really come to grips with where we're going with this. I think this is it's going to take a decade or more to sort of figure out how is this going to go. And I think that's similar with, the church and, the Catholic Church, and how we look at, betting generally, cautious at best. I think a particularly challenging one is the name, image, and likeness that you mentioned, Jane. These athletes at Catholic universities, what are our responsibilities as a university to these young men and women? And when money gets involved, the point of sports becomes explicitly monetary. It's commodified, it's commercialized. And I think we're not naive enough to say that it wasn't that way a decade ago. But when this commodification, commercialization comes out into the fore, I think at the least it should give us some significant pause and kind of figure out, like, wait a minute, what are we doing here? How does this play out? Where does the role for big time college sports on a college campus? And I think professional sports, it's a bit of a different animal. I think we're still working at what that is. But there's some that are how does this impact the high school sports scene, the youth club scene? I think there's a lot of questions that are so new to us that we don't quite know how to handle. And I do think that the church, and with our Catholic social doctrine, does provide some, at least offers, here's some of the questions we should be asking ourselves about these issues. But those are some thorny ones, Jane, by for sure.
Well, thank you all very much. I'm going to hand it over to Ruth now, who has rejoined us for a couple, I think, additional questions and to wrap up.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I've not been rejoining. I've been listening like this, a very good spectator in this sporting event, if you will. And before I start asking some of our questions or my questions, I wanted to remind our spectators, our participants, that they are welcome to ask questions too. So if you've been taking notes, or if you have any questions that pop up as you've listened, or as you hear my questions, feel free to put those in the chat and I can ask them. So I'll start with some of my questions. And I know, Jen, you just went off camera, but my first question is actually to you. So as somebody who has participated, you've done such a great job as the panel, moderator, but as somebody who has participated in the Vatican event itself and is an important voice in sports media, I was wondering if you can share some of your insights. What do you think are the main takeaways for the sporting world, let's say, from religion and spirituality?
Well, very much, you heard this from a lot of our panelists, but very much about recentering the focus of sports from, this idea of elite competition to individual competition. I've, just personally, as somebody who played sports in an era, I was born in 1971. It was the year before Title IX. There were not a lot of people who thought I needed to go pro in anything in the town where I grew up in the time when I was growing up. But I very much got a lot out of sports. I don't think, I certainly wouldn't have this role, but I think, sports taught me a lot, right? Sports are an education in some ways. And I think anybody who gets into higher education and, had that experience with sports kind of understands that it is both in some ways an academic, we make it an academic pursuit, but it's also a deeply personal one. And so I think there are commonalities there between spirituality and, and the experience of playing sports, in that, we experience them both as theoretical things, but then also as deeply personal ones. And so that was kind of, it was a way for me to kind of reflect on that on a more personal level, especially given the kind of the role that I have now.
Right, thank you. And actually, for me, one of the most sentences that stood out is what you said, Steve, about competing for what's possible. As somebody who's very much like Father Colin, been the kid that runs away from balls. When I did start to get into more exercise-based, yoga, Pilates, running, jogging, all of these things, for me was not for competitive reasons, but to see what my body can do to get reacquainted with the body. So I really like that, and I actually just retweeted it. So my next question is about a statement that you made, Father Colin. You said the human person is hardwired for excellence, and I want to share or to think together if we can explore that further. I spent a few years in Denmark, where there's actually a social norm of not excelling. Nobody wants to excel. Everybody wants to be average. Like you're brought up to think and want to be part of the group, to not stand out in any way. So I wonder if that hardwiredness for excellence is very much a American, US based cultural kind of a thing, because also later in the panel you brought back sports as an element of belonging. So maybe what we're hardwired to is to belong, And in different cultures, belonging might look in different ways. So sports in some element or in some institutions can be about excelling, but in others it can be about that communal play. And I know I quoted you, Father Colin, but if any one of the other panelists have anything to say, please jump in.
Well, thank you. I would just say, Ruth, yes, and we could go on all day, of course. Jane was just talking about how deeply personal sports are. I think one of the things we realize is how deeply interpersonal sports are. In the movies, at least, the quarterback will always say, you know what I'll really miss is the look of the other guys in the huddle, before that snap. And what I'll really miss is the locker room and all of that stuff. I think when I say, as a priest, we are hardwired for excellence, what I'm really saying is not that we are hardwired for winning or achieving at the expense of another, but we are hardwired to become fully who we are called to be. We are hardwired for the excellence that is love by a God who is love. And in some of the Nordic countries, that might look a little different. I would still insist that we need some excellent people at the front of the pack to keep us moving along. If everybody was like me, the world would be standing still or maybe going backwards, So I'm grateful for the people who are leading the way in so many ways. But yeah, I'm looking at a former division. I'm looking out the window right now at a former Division I athlete of ours, women's basketball player. Last year, I was watching her on the court and finding myself praying, "Hallowed be thy name." And now I'm looking at her leading some sort of small group out on the lawn, not athletes. Hallowed be thy name again. And the same way when I see a child in a wheelchair trying to push a ball down toward a goal on a basketball court. Hallowed be thy name. Excellence can look all sorts of ways.
Great, thank you. Other panelists' thoughts?
You really can't add to what Father Colin said. I think he nailed it. I think it's very individualized, and it's pushing ourselves beyond our comfort zones, and whatever that means to the individual.
Great, thank you. So one of my last questions before we wrap it up, or actually I'll ask Emily's question first. So Emily asks, without trying to be too far beyond the scope of the event, does this idea of the drive for excellence as a reflective of God's nature extends to other mediums or activities? For example, if someone is much more inclined to the arts than to sports, do they exhibit the same traits of discipline and such, or is it intrinsic to sports? Thoughts?
Forgive me for jumping right in.
Yeah, go for it.
I don't think there's anybody who wants to write a bad book or, I don't think there's anybody who ever looks to write a bad song or paint a bad painting. We just goodness, truth, beauty. That is who we are as human beings. And yes, and the discipline of an author, I've heard podcasts, write every day, write at the same time every day, no matter what you do, work on your craft over and over again. The discipline is praiseworthy too.
Thank you. So I know we only have about 5 minutes left, and this might be a question for our next event, but I'll ask it anyway. We talked a lot today about the Catholic perspective on body, on community, on belonging, as they relate to sport. Do any of you have ideas, and maybe from your classrooms, for your education, or just general ideas about how other religious traditions have related to sports? And I'm using the word sports specifically because, for example, as I mentioned, I practiced yoga for a long time, and I know that the origins of yoga is a very different relationship to what was the word? I think I don't remember if it was Max or Father Colin who said something like spiritual athletes, right? So yoginis might be spiritual athletes. But yeah, so if you have any words you want to say about those interactions in other religions.
I think it is fair to say that yes, this is something the Catholic tradition will certainly emphasize this, but when you look at even certain, and I don't want to speak for all Protestant denominations, there are a lot of ones they're very different, but there was a movement in the middle of the 19th century called the Muscular Christian movement that sought to, as Max said, there was a point in our history where there's a very puritanical view of sport and recreation that was all work, no play, and if you're playing, then you're doing something you shouldn't be doing. But that started to come together in the in the 19th century with this Muscular Christian movement, and so it persists today. You look at the Fellowship of Christian Athletes, you look at a number of other groups that embrace the notion of our physical natures with our spiritual natures and the importance of both of them. I don't know. I can't really speak to Buddhism or any of the non-Christian religions. I don't know if Max has any experience with that.
Yeah, and like Stephen, I'm not as well read or as deeply versed in that as perhaps I should be. But I think that to the extent that I understand, I mean, that there is curiosity. This is, sports are a phenomenon that crosses all barriers and boundaries, cultural, religious, and so, it certainly would not be our claim that sports are a Christian thing or a Catholic thing. This is a universal human thing, and how we come at it, and we the Catholic Church can learn a lot by engaging and encountering how other traditions perceive and interact with sports in that way. And I think that that's part of what our role as academics, speaking for myself, I suppose, of finding those ways to encourage and cultivate that which is best in humanity. And I think finding ways and common ground, and many other traditions have components of them, elements of them that are very amenable to that type of dialogue. So there's a lot of hope there.
I will say this though, one thing that is unique to that the Christian tradition holds onto is the fact that, and especially the Catholic tradition, is there is no dualism in terms of the human person. The human person is fundamentally good in both body and soul. And there can be a tradition or a perception in other traditions where, what is material, what is those things that are relegated to our bodies in the physical world can sometimes be perceived as not so good. And that is something that is very unique to Catholicism, because Christianity is unique among all the religions, that we believe God became man. We believe that God took on human flesh in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. And so therefore, he was fully human and fully divine. And therefore, our bodies are redeemed and fundamentally good because we believe we are created in the image and likeness of God. And we shouldn't reject our bodies or the material world as somehow being, less worthy or less righteous or less good than our spiritual selves.
Thank you. I think I have like a million more questions just about this topic as a religious scholar myself, and as somebody who's interested in, how these things developed. Oh, but we have another question from the chat. So I know we're almost over our time, but I do want to read our chat questions. So Dante asks, not to be devil's advocate, but I am interested in how you guys view a primetime athlete like Dante Wilder, who publicly came out and spoke about a belief in multiple gods and devil worship. How does his huge amount of success counteracts our discussion? I hope I read all of that fine.
I'm not sure if it counteracts. I mean, because you can have all kinds of beliefs. I don't think that what we're saying is that the intersection of sports and spirituality is it doesn't negate the potentiality for, the devil or people who want to believe in the devil. That's fine. He can believe whatever he wants to believe, and I don't think success. It depends. What does success mean? It's not despite his beliefs or because of his beliefs. He can believe what he wants to. I don't think success in sports necessarily has anything to do with having a Christian spirituality.
Yeah, I think that was definitely the tone that I understood from the panel. But I do love, Dante, that you're devil's advocate. Ha ha ha. Okay, so we are out of time. I did have a few additional questions, but we'll just have to save it to our next event or panel. I don't know, Jane, if you want to say some closing words, and after that, I'll just say goodbye.
I just want to say thank you to everybody here. This was really illuminating. I'm going to take this, back with me and mull it and probably take it into the classroom in some form or the other later. Max, you are an absolute superstar showing up today like you did. I cannot say enough. Thank you so much. Everybody should go out and read his book, learn more about this subject if you're interested. And thank you all so much, Father Colin and Professor Kass. Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane.
Thanks for
Thank you,
having us.
Thanks,
Jane.
Ruth.
Thank you all. Thank you for the director of the Institute for Common Religion for supporting us and bringing this together. Thank you for the amazing folks in our technology center for creating this event and shepherding us through it. And again, special thank you for our excellent speakers for an afternoon discussion that was more than intriguing, even for somebody who does not play sports. I was just hooked to the screen. So thank you again. And if anybody has any questions or more interest in these events, the event is recorded, will be published, and will be happy to receive any additional feedback. Thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody. Bye now.